For our second lesson in the church and gender, we're going to take another introductory pass at a little bit of history, because I need to clear the air about a word and a topic that always becomes a distraction to me when we're talking about gender. Eventually, someone says the word feminist, right? And they say, well, you're either a feminist or I'm a feminist and you're not, or that's just something we believe because of feminism, or we know better because of feminism, or whatever. Like, that word gets brought up into the discussion. And so what I want to do for this lesson is just clear the air on that word before we even open a Bible to a single verse and ask ourselves, what should we think about gender in the church, which we really are going to start on next lesson, I promise. I want to start with just a little question of, what is this word feminism and why do we find it so distracting? The first thing you need to know about feminism is it probably ought to be feminisms, plural. I can't even say it, so apparently that's not a good idea. But feminism historically encompasses three social movements. And so to say, I am a feminist or I am not a feminist, you kind of have to know, well, what context are we talking about? Because feminism isn't a word that always meant the same thing. First wave feminism, it's usually discussed in three waves, encompasses anything from about 1830 to 1930s. We'll talk about that in a second. Second wave feminism probably is 1960 to 1980s, thereabout. Third wave feminism, 1990s, maybe to the present. There is a group right now saying we're fourth wave feminists, which would be a whole other thing, but I only have so much room in my brain for waves, so we're just going to stick with three for now, and if there's a fourth one on the way, then we'll deal with that when we get there. But for now, there's three distinct waves of feminism. That's how it's usually taught. First wave feminism goes back again. Remember, this is anything from the 30s back. Pursued racial and social justice. Okay, they pursued specifically the right to vote for women. That was their main goal, suffrage. It culminated in the 19th Amendment. Okay, that was their major victory of that movement. And that movement was largely Christian influenced. I think I was looking at one of the major feminist movements of that era. Its first ever meeting was in the basement of a Methodist church. I mean, it's clearly a Christian motivated group of people. They were very vocal in trying to get prohibition passed. They were against alcohol because they saw alcoholic men beating women, and they said, well, if we're going to protect women, we need to get rid of that altogether. As history bore out, that didn't go really well in American history, but in any event, that was kind of part of that movement, and it was a very Christian-motivated movement. So if you ask yourself, it's 1935, and you say, are you a Christian or a feminist? They're just going to kind of scratch their head and say, I have no idea what you're talking about, because lots of Christians were feminists and lots of feminists were Christians, and there was not any sense, I would think, that you had to pick. I'm sure somebody thought there was, but by and large, that wasn't the case. Second wave feminism, we're talking about now from the 60s onward, they fought for social equality. If you remember last lesson, we talked about equality and social equality as dealing with equal opportunities and equal access and equal status, not just legal equality. And so they're looking for, why is it that men and women are being paid differently in the same careers? They're looking for access to employment for men and women. They're focused more on the home and the workplace. As kind of a side note, I don't want to get into today, part of this story involves the development and availability of birth control, which kind of changed the landscape a little bit of how men and women in society were going to have their outcomes. Don't have to have a strong opinion on that right now, just to say that played into it. Okay, that's part of the history. Typically, historians will split this group into equal rights feminists and revolutionary feminists. Equal rights feminists were happy to get greater social equality. The group that's called revolutionary feminist, we usually describe as saying that they wanted something more. They wanted the advancement of women, perhaps even over and beyond equality. They were looking for something else. I don't know if that's a fair description or not, but that's how it's sometimes described. In the same way that the previous generation considered the 19th Amendment their great accomplishment, the two great accomplishments of this movement were Title IX and then Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade, again, related to birth control and birth and that issue, and Title IX related to equal access and opportunity, okay, for men and women. So you can see where, again, those two topics played into that wave of feminism. Third wave feminism, I'll be honest, is a little more difficult to define. They pursued justice for all the marginalized. The term that's often used in this context is intersectional. And what that means is that they were noticing it's not just as simple as one class or another. It's not as simple as race, white versus black, or male versus female, or later, of straight versus homosexual. They would talk about what about how these issues kind of combine in individual lives to make life. A black homosexual woman has a different life than a white heterosexual woman or a white heterosexual man. So there's more components of that discussion in the third wave. One author I was reading, who is in fact a feminist, said, due to the range of feminist issues today, it is much harder to put a label on what feminist looks like. It's not clear exactly, there's not a clear, coherent movement in the way there was in the 30s or even in the 60s. And so feminism is alive and well, but it encompasses so much more and is allied with so many more different strands of a society, it's more difficult to talk about. So now to our question that we kind of opened with, can a Christian be a feminist? Well, defined one way, probably not. If your definition of feminism is, I want the advancement of women regardless of justice, regardless of equality, regardless of the will of God in any given circumstance, I want that as an absolute above all else, well, that doesn't sound like something a Christian believes. On the other hand, if by feminist you mean I want women to be treated with equality as image-bearing creatures created in the image of God, and all that entails, then, well, yeah, you'd better be a feminist if you're a Christian. That's why the early suffragettes were Christians, by and large. So you can see where that's kind of tricky to talk about, just what do you mean by it? So when somebody says, Ben, it sounds like you're saying something a feminist would say, I'd say, which one? I mean, what are you talking about? I don't know what we're talking about. So then what do we do with the Bible? That's a more interesting question to me as a minister. History is all well and good, but I want to know, if you say, okay, I'm a feminist, and this is my Bible, how does a feminist read the Bible? Or how could a feminist read the Bible? In basic terms, there's about 3 schools of thought when you look at feminist theology and feminist Bible interpretation. One group will say the Bible demeans women and must be questioned and rejected. Okay, that's just a fact. When you read it, it's just hateful to women, period. It teaches young men especially to hate women. And so we have to get rid of the Bible or else find ways to radically edit it. Second group would say, well, maybe it's not that bad. The Bible could be interpreted in a way that demeans women, but it doesn't have to be. So it must be interpreted in a way that creates a complete gender equality, even if interpretations are sometimes creative. So that group's going to look and say, when I read a passage and it sounds like there's inequality, I'm going to keep working on it until I get equality in it, right? So they're a little more optimistic about the Bible being good for women. I'm very glad. But they're more willing to stray from what we'd normally think is kind of the normal rules for interpreting the Bible, as long as gender equality is the result. And then the third group says the Bible affirms equality if fairly understood. Right? They're very optimistic about the Bible. If you pick up the Bible, read it cover to cover, interpreted it fairly, you would come away saying men and women are equal. The end. Right? So they advance that in that way. So you can see there's 3 very different points of view of how a person comes to the Bible when they have a more feminist mindset. And so again, when you say, well, how would a feminist think about this? Or are you a feminist? Or is this a feminist point of view? I'd say, who are you talking about? I don't even know what that means because there's so much variety. I've read a fair bit of feminist criticism and interpretation of the Bible because I find it interesting. So let me just share some good things that come out of feminist readers of the Bible. They have noticed correctly that gender and experience do influence how you read the Bible. Okay, my experience as a male affects the way that I read the Bible. Of course it does. Last week we talked about creation, and we said men and women sin differently and experience the suffering of sin differently. Well, if that's true, it would make sense that the way I engage with God might also be different in some ways. So when I read the Bible, sometimes I get something different out of it than a woman would, and a woman may get something different out of it than I do. That's good to recognize. That's not a bad thing. It's why maybe we should study the Bible together. That would be good. The Bible has often been interpreted in a male-centric manner. That's also true. If you look in history, look at the great commentators of the Bible for the last 2,000 years, there have been some times where women would look at the commentary and say, "What are you guys doing?" One of my favorite is the book of Judges, where some of the medieval commentaries on Judges look at these stories where terrible things are done to women and try to justify them and say, well, it's probably okay, which no woman reading that story would ever say. No woman would read a story about horrible things happening to women and say, it's probably all right. But men, because they just didn't share that experience, they didn't live in that world, it was easier for them to overlook those stories or read them completely differently and kind of gloss over them. So yeah, I'm actually a fan of a fair bit of what's been called feminist criticism of the Bible. One of my favorite books on Old Testament material and female stories is a book called Texts of Terror by Phyllis Tribble. I'm not actually a huge fan of Phyllis Tribble in other areas of her work, but I found that book really insightful, the way she tells the story of a woman like Hagar. When I read the Hagar story in Genesis, I'm just going to gloss right over it, right? I'm interested in Abraham. Why? Well, look at me. I even look like Abraham probably looked, right? I mean, I'm a big bearded man. Of course, I'm interested in Abraham and his story. I'm not interested in Hagar. Phyllis Tribble is. And so when you read her chapter about Hagar, man, it comes to life in ways that I find very powerful. Got news for you. I've preached Phyllis Tribble feminist criticism material on Hagar because it's one of my favorite sermons, because it's really great stuff to have someone who has a different experience than you point out, here are some things that are in your Bible that you should notice, okay? So yeah, there's some really good things to listening to women, letting women who even identify as feminist, they're telling you right up front, I am reading this as a woman, and I want to tell you what I see and hear. I think that's great. That's not a problem. What would be some bad things from a feminist reading of the Bible? Well, it's possible that the feminist ideal becomes privileged over the Bible itself and the author's intent. That it's always possible, if you go to the Bible looking for something, you always find it. You didn't find it fairly, but you'll find it. And so any ideology, and I don't care what it is, feminism, nationalism, white supremacy, capitalism, communism, socialism, scientism, whatever ism you want, if you go to the Bible looking for that, that's exactly what you'll find. And so I do get nervous when I see the feminist commentator look at the Bible, and of course they see everything, even things that don't really seem to be about women, and saying something provocative. I was reading at one point a feminist interpretation of Jonah. I don't know, it kind of blew my mind. I thought, how did you find there's not any women in the story of Jonah, but somehow they kind of worked through the narrative and found those elements and brought it to life. And I thought, kind of felt like you went looking for it and found it. I read a paper for a paper I wrote. I was reading another paper doing research titled Behold the Lord's Whore. And it was a reinterpretation of the story of Mary, which essentially accused God of rape and giving her the Immaculate Conception of Jesus. Again, you kind of got to go looking for that one. It's not obvious in the text. I think they read something in it. And in that same sense, another bad thing that comes out of this ideologically driven interpretation of the Bible is that every male character and every male interpreter becomes untrustworthy. Okay, I got news for you. This is just a fact. It doesn't matter if you're feminist or misogynist or whatever you are. There's a lot of males in the Bible. Content-wise, it's just true. If you decide every male you encounter in the Bible is untrustworthy, and every man that you meet in life is untrustworthy, that doesn't sound like the kind of relationship between men and women that God intended in creation. And so that would be an enormous problem for me. I'll give you an example of this gone to kind of an extreme. In one chapter on feminist hermeneutics, Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza, who I think, if I remember correctly, was the first female president of the Society of Biblical Literature several years back. She wrote, "A feminist theologian must question whether the historical man Jesus of Nazareth can be a role model for contemporary women, since feminist psychological liberation means exactly the struggle of women to free themselves from all male internalized norms and models." Okay, and I'm not here criticizing Dr. Schussler-Fiorenza. She's also a very bright mind. But when she writes this, I think she's missed it, right? That if I have an ideology that says, I just don't know if I can treat Jesus as a role model, I don't know if I should imitate Jesus because I'm not a man and he's a man and I'm a woman, so maybe I need to find something else, then I think we've missed a lot of what's going on in the gospel. If you read the Gospels, especially, I would encourage you to read the Gospel of Luke, which we'll reference later in a future lesson. Lots and lots of women interact with Jesus and found him to be liberating, and found him to be empowering, and found him to be wonderful. Women grew the early church more than men did. That's a sociological, historical fact. Okay, it's incredible. So to look at that same man, Jesus of Nazareth, and say, I don't know, we may need to free ourselves from male psychology and not see him in that way. You've let your ideology drag you through the Bible in a way that's not healthy. So what are some conclusions for our study, kind of moving forward? I did this lesson on the history of feminism to just kind of clear the air about it. What I want you to know. Number one, Christians should not reject a reasonable Bible interpretation for fear of being feminist. So in this class, at no point do I want to hear you say, it sounds like feminist. Feminist can mean more than one thing, and I don't care what the Bible sounds like, I care what it says. So if we read the Bible and interpret it fairly, the best we can, with integrity and authenticity, and it says something that sounds like what a feminist says, all that means was the feminist was right that time because the Bible is true. Okay? I'm not going to reject any reasonable Bible interpretation for fear that that might make me a feminist. Likewise, Christians should not accept an unreasonable Bible interpretation because it agrees with feminism. Never should you say, I've got my ideology and I know what I want to believe, and when I go to the Bible, I'm going to find it. That's always dangerous, and it doesn't even matter what ideology it is. Again, whether it's nationalism, capitalism, communism, socialism, misogyny or patriarchy or feminism or same-sex attraction or whatever ideology you want. When you decide, that's my ideology, now let me read the Bible, you're already in trouble. Ultimately, the Bible is true and every man a liar. We start with that book, we hear what God says, and we let it guide us. If we can't do that, then the rest of this class isn't actually worth very much to us. So my encouragement to you is, don't be distracted by unwarranted negativity that's put on the word feminism. I don't know if you'd call me a feminist or not. I got to tell you, I really don't care. It's not a word that I brandish, as a badge one way or another, and it's not a word that I shun because it would put me in the wrong crowd. It's just a word that's used historically to describe a certain point of view. And if Christians all end up being feminist in the final account of history, if we were doing what the Bible said, great. If we weren't, then shame on us. And that's the only question. So don't get hot and bothered about that particular word and distracted by it. I think that's going to be really important moving forward. It can be a good word. It can be a bad word. It really depends on whether we're following God or not, more than any ideology. All right, that's enough for now. Discuss that. And then next week, we're going to dive into different schools of thought related to the topic of gender.